And the guy we talked to a couple of months ago when his book came out, A Republic No More, Big Government and the Rise of American Political Corruption. A new book is out for Kindle and available in paperback as well. What's so bad about cronyism? Jay Cost is back. Good morning, Jay.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate you coming back on. Before we get started, can I purchase your Quadrophenia is overrated Trump hat anywhere, or is that just for display purposes?
That's just for display. That was just to tweak a friend of mine on Twitter. So yeah, just for display purposes.
But you're more of a kinks guy too, if I have read your tweets correctly through the years.
Yes, I love Quadrophenia too. I was just trying to get it more time.
The new book is you can get it on Amazon, Kindle or paperback. What's so bad about cronyism? People are going to look perhaps and see 48 pages. What's that about? It's kind of what? It's a mini book. It's a distillation of the main arguments from A Republic No More in general.
Yeah. That's right. It's part of a series of books that Encounter Books publishes called Broadsides, which are just sort of small books that are essays on timely topical subjects, and the idea is that you can sort of sit down in an evening and read the whole thing.
And it's appropriate and timely, I think, based on what happened just on Friday with the reviving of the dead Export-Import Bank, Crony Capitalism.
Yeah, that bank just never seems to want to just sit down and die. I don't know why. I don't know how to explain that. But yeah, I mean, the Export-Import Bank is, I think, a classic example of cronyism. This is an institution of dubious economic utility. I mean, we hear a lot about it, but it rarely did they actually describe what it does. Because when you describe what it does, it sounds so ridiculous that we would be doing this. But what the Export-Import Bank essentially finances loans for overseas companies to import goods from American manufacturers. And, I mean, right off the bat, you're thinking, we're actually financing loans to develop the economies of other countries. And the answer is yes, that's exactly what we do. And, on top of that, global trade is a very intricate, complicated network. So to think that we can just, we're helping American commerce by facilitating loans for one exporter. Well, if the other country's business is in competition with American businesses, then that somebody else is going to be hurt. Which is exactly why a company like Delta Airlines opposes the Export-Import Bank. It's really a very dubious economic utility.
It's mostly for Boeing, right? And Boeing is like 50% of all Export-Import Bank loans?
Yeah, it's overwhelmingly for Boeing. It's overwhelmingly for GE, like after that. Like it's really just by and large used by the largest corporations in the United States. And those corporations spend a lot of money on the political process, and and by the way, too, like if you look originally, the Export-Import Bank was created during the New Deal. This is another, I don't really get into this in the book, but, bureaucracies tend to have, what's called mission creep. Like, have you ever noticed how peculiar it is? Like, NASA seems to spend all of its time trying to find water on other planets. This is not why NASA was founded in the 1950s or whenever it was founded. It's the same thing with the Export-Import Bank. Like, the Export-Import Bank one of the purposes of the Export-Import Bank was as a foreign policy tool. So, and that made a lot more sense from America's national interest perspective for the Export-Import Bank to go about financing economic development loans in South and Central America when we were trying to, extend our sphere of influence and limit the communist sphere of influence. But, after those foreign policy goals sort of fell by the wayside, the Export-Import Bank had to find a new mission. And, that's a pretty typical thing that bureaucracies do.
Jay Cost is with us from the Weekly Standard. His new book is available. It's linked up on our Twitter feed, and you can find it at Amazon, too. What's so bad about cronyism? Now, that word is tossed around now in debates and political discussions, and perhaps it's needed to define it a little bit, or at least make it simpler, right? Cronyism, public dollars at risk for private gain. Is that about it?
Yeah, I would say that's an excellent definition, that the idea would be the politicians use public resources or public dollars, as you said, to benefit their friends or their political associates, their, campaign benefactors, prospective employers, powerful interest groups in their districts, so on and so forth.
And that's, people say they're not connected to politics. People don't want politicians, quote unquote. The people who have not held political office in a Republican primary are grabbing 55, 60% of the total vote. Cronyism, the thought, the idea that the politicians are only in it to help their friends and not the public writ large, it goes to really one of the core problems or core issues I think many voters have with politics these days.
Oh, I think that's absolutely the case. When I talk to voters, I spend all my time working on politics. When I talk to people who are civic-minded, but who aren't obsessive like I am, and a lot of times they won't know, like, the details of, say, the Export-Import Bank, but when I explain it to them, they're not at all surprised. So people don't know what's going on, but they know what's going on. And, they know that politicians these sorts of practices are widespread. And I think also, distressingly, I think, that we have this entire infrastructure or edifice of campaign consultants and speech writers and soundbite crafters that are designed to persuade the public. Well, the public's gotten wise to that. And I think especially on the Republican side, anybody can sound like Ronald Reagan in a 30-second soundbite clip. The problem is that the voters have gotten wise to it now, and so they just don't trust politicians in general. So when you see Ben Carson, Carly Fiorina, and even Donald Trump come out, and they don't have backgrounds in politics, I think people find that, refreshing.
Jay Cost with us from the Weekly Standard. His new book is What's So Bad About Cronyism. You can find it at Amazon.com. It's linked up at our Twitter feed. John Boehner stepping down as speaker soon, sometime, whenever they find someone to take the job. Perhaps his greatest accomplishment as speaker, the ban on earmarks, which happened just after the Republican takeover in 2010, helped to bring spending down a bit. We're still running deficits, of course, but there's this drive now to bring them back. It's been going on for a couple of years. Our senator, the esteemed Dick Durbin, has argued for bringing them back for a couple of years now, saying, look, we can't do anything in Washington without earmarks. I worry, Jay, and this is a form of cronyism too, I worry, though, that we're going to slide towards that because the argument that Washington doesn't work is so strong. Then the solution is, well, if you want Washington to work, we need to bring back earmarks so everyone gets their palms greased.
Yeah. That is a very common argument I hear. I wouldn't be surprised if earmarks were to come back eventually. Congressional Republicans even have a nasty habit of doing big reforms on, things like Medicare and then, farm subsidies, and then over time they just, let them degrade and then undo them altogether. So I wouldn't be surprised. And by the way, too, according for Citizens Against Government Waste, there are still earmarks. It's just, of course, it depends on what your definition of an earmark is. There's still a lot of that stuff that just got reclassified in the federal budget, and it still adds up. It's not tens of billions of dollars a year, but it's still, 8 or 9 billion, I think, is what their latest estimate was. But, look, this is a common sort of argument in favor of cronyism that, we need to grease the wheels if we're going to get things to work at all. The problem with that is, this is an example I like to give, is that in 1987, they tried that with the highway transportation bill. The highway bill is something that needs to be reauthorized every 4 years, and oftentimes it's a big challenge to wrestle up the vote. So the people in charge of the bill in Congress started delivering out pork to legislators that they thought were on the fence. So, okay, and they got the bill passed, so good for them. That's a point in favor of, Durbin and other people's theory. The challenge is that 4 years later, when they had to reauthorize the bill, by that point, word got out that the appropriators were going to be giving away pork for wavering legislators. So everybody wavered. Everybody wavered because they knew that they were giving away pork, and so they wanted to make sure they got their morsel. And that, by the way, is the real problem with earmarks, is that earmarks, if you look at the growth rate in earmarks, it really speaks to this effect that, like when the Republicans took over Congress in 1994, there were like, $7-8 billion a year in earmarks. By the time they got kicked out of Congress in 2006, there were over $30 billion a year in earmarks. That's the problem with it, is that when everybody figures out that that's the way it works, everybody bellies up to the bar to get their own piece of the action, and the cost of it just ends up ballooning.
Jay Cost with us. What's so bad about cronyism? His new book at Amazon.com, and linked up on our Twitter feed this morning, too. It's Riley and Scott on WROK. So once you convince us via the new book that cronyism is bad, what do we do about it? It seems ingrained in the process at this point.
Yeah, it is ingrained into the process, which is, a point that I try to make in the book, that we can't look at this just as a sort of a subset of politicians are just bad people and we need to get rid of them, that it's worse than that. If that were all that our problem was, then that would be in much better shape. Mm-hmm. And the problem is that it's embedded in the laws themselves. And I argue in the book that the problem gets down to the way our campaign finances are structured. By that I mean that politicians raise money by selling policy to the highest bidders. We have a conflict of interest regime of campaign finance. Think of it this way. If I was a federal judge and you had business before my court, and right before you came into the courtroom, one of your cronies handed me a $5,000 check, and this got published in the Chicago Tribune, I would be impeached and you would be thrown in jail. Mm-hmm. But if I was a subcommittee chairman of the relevant appropriations subcommittee that you had business before, and you wrote me a $5,000 check, far from being thrown in jail, I would get inquiries from my colleagues about how they can get a piece of the action too. This is the problem with cronyism, that the people who have business before government, like actual, and I mean we all have business before government in the broad sense of the word, but people who have actual pieces of legislation in which they have a personal, financial, or professional stake are the ones who, by and large, are financing our politics. This is how cronyism subsists, and this is how it persists over time. And as long as we allow that system of, we don't create an alternative to conflict of interest financing, we're going to continue to have cronyism.
Jay Cost with us for the Weekly Standard, weeklystandard.com, and the new book, What's So Bad About Cronyism. We've got about a minute or so left. If I can turn this quickly toward the speaker race, or the search for a speaker at this point, as Paul Ryan is put on the spot. You were tweeting a bit at the end of last week. This is, the House is raucous. It's the way it is. It's the way it normally has been. It's a little bit overblown, the concern by some journalists about the House GOP unable to come to an immediate consensus on a next speaker. Does it matter? Does this rancor matter in the long run? And does it matter, period, who really becomes speaker in the end?
No, I would say no to both questions. Well, I don't know. I think if they could make a horrible selection as a speaker, I'd say that could be a problem. But I'd say, by and large, no. I think that this matters because it's a symptom of something that the Republican Party leadership in the Beltway has not fully priced in. And that is that their party is massively, shockingly unpopular, including with their own voters. And voters expressed that discontent in 2010 and 2004, and they elected people not only to oppose President Obama, but also to shake things up in this staid, tired, old Republican Party. That's what they were elected to do, and that's what they're doing. Now, maybe they're not going about it the best way, but look, it's the House of Representatives. This is what the House was designed to be. It was supposed to, like you said, raucous, And I think that, this is taken, unfortunately, I don't live in Washington, but, you can keep an eye on what the Washington people are thinking pretty easily over the Internet. And once again, they're just taking this as another indication of how crazy and insane and nihilistic their own voters are. Mm-hmm. Which is just, which to me is just so mind-boggling because these are the same people who came out to vote for John McCain in 2008 and George Bush in 1992 and Mitt Romney in 2012. These are the people who vote for them when they lose. So to insult them like that is just boggles my mind. But beyond that, can you maintain a political coalition without your base point number two. And point number three, you know, the fact of the matter is that the Republican leadership has been promising, you know, fundamental change in the way government works for 20 years since the contract with America in 1995, and they haven't delivered. So, you know, people in the heartland are a little ornery and a little frustrated, and they elected people to express that frustration, and here we are. I mean, to me, the whole thing gets back to the failure of the Republican Party leadership to live up to the promises it makes to win elections every 2 years.
Jay Cost. Follow him at The Weekly Standard. Follow him on Twitter at JCostTWS. And pick up the new book, What's So Bad About Cronyism, for Kindle or on paperback at Amazon and linked up at our Twitter feed. Jay, always appreciate the time and love our conversations. Thanks for coming back.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.